November 25th, 1944, Tokyo, Japan. Lieutenant Colonel Takeo Yamada stood on the roof of the Imperial Army's Air Defense Headquarters, binoculars pressed against his face. The air raid sirens had been wailing for 7 minutes. His spotters had reported enemy aircraft approaching from the southeast, climbing from their bases in the Mariana Islands, 6 hours flying time away. Yamada expected what he had seen before, perhaps 30 bombers, maybe 50 if the Americans were planning something significant. His crews would scramble fighters, fire anti-aircraft batteries, and inflict what damage they could. Some bombers would fall, most would escape. Tokyo would burn in places, but the city would survive. Japan would endure. Then he saw the horizon. It wasn't darkening. It was filling. Formation after formation appeared, stacked in layers, each group following the one before. The formations seemed endless. Yamada began counting, his lips moving silently. 10 groups, 20, 30. His hands started trembling. 40 groups. The mathematics were impossible. Each formation contained 9 to 12 bombers. He stopped counting at 50 groups and simply stared. The sky was becoming metal. Wings glinted in the late afternoon sun. Engine noise built from a distant rumble to an overwhelming roar that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Yamada lowered his binoculars and spoke to his aide without looking away from the approaching armada. "How many?" he asked quietly. His aide's voice shook. "Radar reports at least 300 aircraft, sir. Perhaps more." The operators thought their equipment was malfunctioning. 300 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses were approaching Tokyo in what would become the largest daylight precision bombing raid against Japan to that date. For Colonel Yamada and every Japanese officer who witnessed that day, the sight shattered their understanding of what warfare could be. They had known America was powerful. They had not known America could make the sky itself disappear beneath an ocean of bombers. This is the story of how Japanese commanders counted American B-29s and couldn't believe 1,000 bombers appeared in one raid. It's the story of industrial capacity so overwhelming it redefined what was militarily possible. And it's the story of the psychological breaking point, when numbers became so large, they ceased to be numbers and became something closer to natural disasters. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the most advanced bomber aircraft in the world in 1944. Its pressurized cabin allowed crews to fly at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, above the effective ceiling of most Japanese fighters. Its 4 Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, gave it a maximum speed of 357 miles per hour and a combat range of 3,250 miles. The aircraft stretched 99 feet from nose to tail, with a wingspan of 141 feet. Empty, it weighed 74,500 pounds. Fully loaded with fuel, bombs and crew, it could weigh 135,000 pounds at takeoff. Its bomb capacity reached 20,000 pounds, though typical combat loads ranged from 12,000 to 16,000 pounds, depending on fuel requirements and target distance. But these technical specifications, impressive as they were, tell only part of the story. The real revolution was production. Between 1943 and 1945, American factories built 3,970 B-29 bombers. This represented an aircraft so complex that each one required approximately 595,000 engineering, man-hours, and employed parts from 1,500 subcontractors spread across the United States. 4 major assembly plants produced B-29s. Boeing's facilities in Wichita, Kansas, and Renton, Washington, led production. Bell Aircraft manufactured them in Marietta, Georgia. At peak production in 1944, these factories combined were completing approximately 100 B-29s per month. The Japanese understood bomber production. Their own factories had built approximately 2,600 heavy bombers during the entire war, including the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber and the Nakajima G8N Renzan. Japanese engineers knew how difficult it was to manufacture a large, complex aircraft. They understood the thousands of parts, the precision machining required, the specialized materials needed. What they couldn't grasp was the scale of American production. When intelligence reports indicated the United States was building B-29s by the hundreds per month, Japanese military analysts assumed the reports were exaggerated. American propaganda designed to intimidate them. The mathematics seemed impossible. Surely no nation could produce such complex machines at such rates. Then the bombers started arriving over Japan. The first B-29 raid against the Japanese home islands occurred on June 15, 1944. 47 bombers flying from bases in China attacked the Imperial Iron and Steel Works at Yawata on Kyushu. The raid achieved minimal damage. Several B-29s were lost. Japanese commanders noted the attack but weren't alarmed. 47 bombers represented a nuisance, not an existential threat. What Japanese intelligence didn't immediately understand was that this raid came not from the main American bomber force, but from a secondary base in China supplied by aircraft flying over the Himalayas from India. The logistics were so difficult that the China-based raids never achieved significant scale, but they distracted Japanese attention from what was coming. In November 1944, B-29s began operating from newly constructed airfields in the Mariana Islands. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had fallen to American forces in summer 1944 after savage fighting. Navy construction battalions, the famous Seabees, began building airfields capable of handling B-29 operations. The speed of airfield construction shocked Japanese intelligence officers who monitored the work through aerial reconnaissance. Where jungle and coral rock had stood in August, massive runways appeared by October. The Americans poured concrete as if they possessed unlimited supplies of cement, steel reinforcement, and construction equipment. Because they did. Each airfield required runways 8,500 feet long and 200 feet wide, capable of handling fully loaded B-29s. The aircraft's weight and high landing speed demanded smooth, strong surfaces. The Seabees built them using Marston matting, interlocking steel planks that could be laid rapidly over graded earth, and concrete poured in sections around the clock. Tinian Island, which measured roughly 12 miles long and 6 miles wide, received 4 parallel runways and became essentially one enormous airbase. At peak operations, Tinian housed 6 B-29 bombardment groups, approximately 300 bombers. The island's North Field became the busiest airfield in the world, launching more aircraft on combat missions than any other base in any country. Japanese commanders on the home islands knew these bases were being built. They knew B-29s would soon reach Japan regularly. What they didn't anticipate was the rate at which American bomber strength would increase. The first major raid from the Marianas struck Tokyo on November 24, 1944. 111 B-29s participated. The target was the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashi engine plant. Results were mixed. High-altitude bombing through cloud cover proved difficult. Some bombers hit the target. Many didn't. Japanese defenses shot down or damaged several B-29s. Japanese commanders analyzed the raid and felt cautiously optimistic. 111 bombers represented a serious attack, but their defenses had functioned. Fighters had intercepted the formations. Anti-aircraft batteries had scored hits. The Americans had demonstrated they could reach Japan from the Marianas, but the toll they paid suggested such raids would be limited and costly. This assessment was profoundly wrong. Throughout December 1944 and January 1945, B-29 raids continued to increase in size. Raids of 150 bombers became common, then 200. Japanese fighter squadrons scrambled to intercept each raid, but the altitude advantage of the B-29s made interception difficult. Japanese fighters like the Ki-84 Hayate and the J-2M Raiden could reach 30,000 feet, but they performed poorly at that altitude. Their engines lost power in the thin air. Their controls became sluggish. They couldn't maintain the speed and maneuverability necessary to press attacks against formations defended by dozens of half-inch caliber machine guns. Japanese anti-aircraft artillery faced similar limitations. The standard Type 88 75mm anti-aircraft gun could reach high altitude, but targeting fast-moving bombers at extreme range proved extremely difficult. Japanese fire control systems lacked the sophisticated radar and computing equipment that American and German systems employed. Japanese gunners fired by sight and estimation, achieving hit rates that disappointed their commanders. Most fundamentally, Japan simply didn't have enough anti-aircraft guns. American industrial capacity had supplied Britain with thousands of anti-aircraft weapons. Germany had ringed its cities with dense networks of flak batteries. Japan's industrial limitations meant anti-aircraft coverage remained sparse. Major cities had defences, but not in sufficient density to create the walls of steel that German flak could achieve. So as American bomber numbers increased, Japanese defences became progressively less effective. More bombers meant more targets to track and engage. Japanese fighter controllers found themselves overwhelmed, trying to coordinate intercepts against formations that stretched across miles of sky. Anti-aircraft gunners fired until their ammunition ran low, then watched helplessly as additional waves continued overhead. The psychological impact began building. On February 19, 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command. LeMay had commanded bomber operations in Europe, flying B-17 raids against Germany. He understood strategic bombing. He also understood that the tactics being used against Japan weren't working well enough or fast enough. High-altitude precision bombing in daylight produced mixed results. Cloud cover over Japan was frequent. Bombing through clouds meant missing targets. The jet stream winds at high altitude over Japan, sometimes exceeding 200 miles per hour, played havoc with bomb accuracy. Bombardiers trained for European conditions found Japanese weather conditions created problems they hadn't anticipated. LeMay made a decision that shocked his subordinates. He ordered his B-29s to attack at night, from low altitude, carrying incendiary bombs instead of high explosives. The logic was ruthless and effective. Japanese cities contained vast areas of wood and paper construction. Industrial facilities were often dispersed through residential neighborhoods. Creating massive fires would destroy both military targets and the workers' housing that supported those targets. Low-altitude attacks would increase bombing accuracy and allow larger bomb loads because less fuel was needed. Night attacks would reduce losses to fighters since Japanese night fighter capabilities were limited. The defensive armament could be reduced to save weight. More bombs, more destruction, fewer losses. Japanese commanders didn't immediately understand what was coming. The first indication came on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945. That night, 325 B-29s attacked Tokyo carrying incendiary bombs. They flew at altitudes between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, far lower than previous raids. They dropped their bombs in a specific pattern designed to create a firestorm. The lead aircraft marked the target area with incendiaries. Following bombers dropped their loads into the growing fires. The result was Operation Meeting House, the deadliest air raid in human history. 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs fell on a 16-square-mile area of eastern Tokyo. The fires merged into a firestorm with winds exceeding 100 miles per hour, rushing inward to feed the flames. Temperatures reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood burst into flame without direct contact with fire. Metal melted, glass liquefied. Approximately 100,000 people died that night. Most suffocated as the firestorm consumed available oxygen. Others burned. Some drowned, seeking refuge in rivers and canals, where they were pushed underwater by panicked crowds. 16 square miles of Tokyo ceased to exist. 1/4 of the city's buildings vanished. Over 1 million people became homeless. For Japanese commanders, the scale of destruction was incomprehensible. One raid, one night, 100,000 dead. This exceeded the death toll from any previous air raid against any city anywhere. This was more destructive than either atomic bomb would be, and this was just one raid. 2 nights later, on March 11th to 12th, 279 B-29s firebombed Nagoya. On March 13th to 14th, 274 B-29s firebombed Osaka. On March 16th to 17th, 307 B-29s struck Kobe. In 10 days, American bombers had burned 4 of Japan's 6 largest cities, with a casualty toll exceeding 250,000 people. Japanese air defenses had effectively collapsed. Fighter interceptions remained sporadic. Anti-aircraft fire damaged some bombers but couldn't stop the attacks. The overwhelming numbers made defense nearly impossible. When 300 bombers approached simultaneously, even if defenses destroyed 10%, 270 bombers still reached their targets and dropped their bombs. And the Americans kept coming. Throughout April and May 1945, the firebombing campaign expanded to smaller cities. The Americans had burned the largest urban centers and turned to the secondary targets. Cities with populations between 50,000 and 350,000 began receiving visits from formations of 100 to 300 B-29s. The attacks followed a pattern. Night raids, low altitude, incendiary bombs, city after city burned. Toyama, Yokohama, Kawasaki, Numazu, Shizuoka, Kofu, Fukuoka, Omuta, Yokkaichi, Tsu. Each raid destroyed vast sections of these cities. Survivors emerged from shelters to find their neighborhoods gone. Entire districts reduced to ash and rubble. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The statistics accumulated into a narrative of destruction that defied comprehension. By July 1945, 66 Japanese cities had been extensively bombed. Approximately 40% of the urban area in 66 cities had been destroyed. Over 330,000 civilians were confirmed dead. 8.5 million people had been rendered homeless. These numbers represented direct casualties from the bombing campaign alone, not including combat deaths or casualties from other causes. The industrial impact proved equally devastating. Japan's aircraft production fell from almost 3,000 planes per month in early 1945 to fewer than 700 per month by July. Not because factories were all destroyed, though many were, but because the disruption to transportation, power supplies, and workforce housing made production increasingly impossible. Oil refineries burned, storage tanks exploded, aluminum plants melted. The complex supply chains necessary for modern industrial production unraveled as cities burned and transportation systems collapsed. Japan's ability to wage war was being destroyed from the air, one firebombing raid at a time. Japanese commanders understood they were witnessing something unprecedented in military history. They had studied the German experience with Allied bombing. They knew about Hamburg's firestorm in 1943. They knew about Dresden in February 1945, but those were single raids against single cities. The Americans were conducting Hamburg-level firestorm raids against dozens of Japanese cities in succession. The capacity seemed unlimited. Private communications between senior Japanese military officers, intercepted and decoded by American intelligence after the war, revealed the despair these raids created. Generals accustomed to discussing tactical situations in confident terms began using language that suggested psychological collapse. "The bombing cannot be stopped," one army general wrote to a colleague. "Our fighters cannot reach them in sufficient numbers. Our anti-aircraft cannot track so many targets. The American capacity appears infinite." A naval officer stationed in Yokosuka wrote to his family in the countryside, advising them to remain there and under no circumstances enter any city. "The Americans can burn any city they choose," he explained. "There is no defense. Shelters only delay death. The fires consume everything." The scale of American bomber operations over Japan in the final months of the war revealed industrial capacity that seemed almost physically impossible to Japanese observers. The peak came in July 1945, when the 20th Air Force, which controlled all B-29 operations against Japan, flew over 6,500 sorties and dropped 35,000 tons of bombs in 1 month. To understand what this meant, consider the logistics. Each B-29 sortie required approximately 720 gallons of aviation fuel for ground operations and testing, plus 7,000 gallons for the mission itself. Approximately 7,720 gallons per sortie. 6,500 sorties consumed approximately 50 million gallons of aviation fuel in 1 month, just for the B-29s. This didn't include fuel for escort fighters, reconnaissance aircraft, search and rescue operations, or any other aviation activities. That fuel had to be produced in American refineries, loaded onto tankers in American ports, transported across the Pacific Ocean, unloaded at bases in the Marianas, stored in tank farms, and distributed to aircraft as needed. The logistics network required to sustain these operations was itself an industrial achievement equal to the aircraft production that it supported. Each B-29 sortie also required approximately 14,000 pounds of bombs. 6,500 sorties required approximately 45 million pounds of bombs. These bombs had to be manufactured in American factories, shipped across the Pacific, stored in ammunition dumps, and loaded onto aircraft. The explosive content alone required thousands of tons of chemical materials. The casings required steel production dedicated to munitions. The maintenance requirements for 6,500 sorties in 1 month stagger the imagination. Each B-29 required maintenance after every mission. Engine inspections, control surface checks, hydraulic system service, electrical system testing, tire replacement, damage repair. The flight line maintenance crews worked around the clock, keeping aircraft operational. Major maintenance and engine replacements occurred at regular intervals. Engines were removed and shipped back to depot-level facilities for overhaul or replacement. The flow of replacement engines from American factories across the Pacific to operational bases in the Marianas represented a supply chain of extraordinary complexity and reliability. American logistics had created a system where bombers 12,000 miles from home operated with the reliability and intensity of bombers flying from bases inside their own country. The industrial reach that made this possible was what truly defeated Japan. Not just the bombers themselves, but the complete industrial ecosystem that built them, maintained them, supplied them, and sustained operations indefinitely. Japanese military planners had studied American industrial capacity before the war. They knew the United States produced more steel, more oil, more automobiles, more of nearly everything than Japan, but they had assumed that American industrial advantage wouldn't translate directly into military power. They believed American society was too individualistic, too undisciplined, too comfortable to mobilize effectively for total war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, had lived in the United States and understood American industrial power better than most Japanese officers. He famously warned his government that Japan might achieve victories for 6 months or a year, but that a prolonged war with America would end in Japan's defeat. His warnings were noted and ignored. Japanese leadership believed that American will would break before American industry could fully mobilize. They were catastrophically wrong. The B-29 program alone demonstrated industrial capabilities that Japan couldn't match. The development cost of the B-29 program exceeded $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bomb. This single aircraft program cost more than the entire Japanese military budget for 1944. Boeing's Wichita plant, which became the primary B-29 production facility, employed over 29,000 workers at peak production. The factory complex covered approximately 270 acres. The main assembly building measured 1 million square feet. 3 parallel assembly lines operated continuously. Components arrived from subcontractors across the nation, were stored in organized warehouses, then moved to assembly stations according to precise schedules. The production line operated with efficiency that approached assembly line methods Ford had pioneered for automobiles. Major subassemblies, wings, fuselage sections, tail assemblies were built separately, then brought together at final assembly. The nose section, built in one area, contained the bombardier's station, pilot's cabin, and nose gear. The center fuselage section, built elsewhere, contained the bomb bay and wing attachment points. The tail section housed the gunner's position and contained the empennage mounting structure. These major assemblies converged on the final assembly line where they were joined, tested, and completed. At the end of the line, complete bombers rolled out of the factory under their own power. Test pilots flew acceptance flights, checking all systems. Then the aircraft was turned over to the military and added to the combat inventory. The industrial achievement represented by the B-29 wasn't just the aircraft itself, but the complete system that produced it. The aluminum required for each airframe came from smelters supplied with bauxite ore from mines in Arkansas, power from hydroelectric dams, and chemical processes requiring petroleum derivatives. The engines came from Wright Aeronautical Corporation's factories in Ohio. The propellers came from Curtiss Wright facilities. The thousands of instruments, gauges, switches, and controls came from specialized manufacturers. The tires came from rubber companies that had developed synthetic rubber when natural supplies were cut off by Japan's conquests. Every B-29 represented the coordinated output of thousands of companies and hundreds of thousands of workers. The supply chain stretched across the entire United States and demonstrated organizational capabilities that no other nation matched during the war. For Japanese commanders watching these bombers fill their skies, the implications were crushing. Each bomber overhead represented not just one aircraft, but an entire industrial system that could produce such aircraft continuously. The bombers kept coming because the factories kept building them, and the factories kept building them because American industrial capacity was so vast that producing thousands of complex aircraft was merely one part of a much larger war production effort. While building nearly 4,000 B-29s, American factories simultaneously produced approximately 96,000 other aircraft in 1944 alone. Fighters, medium bombers, transport aircraft, trainers, reconnaissance planes, all rolled off assembly lines in numbers that staggered imagination. Japan's total aircraft production for the entire war, approximately 76,000 aircraft of all types from 1941 through 1945, was less than American production in a single year. The mathematical reality was inescapable. America could lose aircraft at rates that would devastate other nations, and simply build replacements faster than they were destroyed. Japan, by contrast, couldn't replace losses. Each aircraft destroyed was gone. Each pilot killed left a gap that couldn't be filled. The training pipeline couldn't produce enough replacement pilots. The factories couldn't build enough replacement aircraft. The fuel shortages meant even aircraft that existed often couldn't fly. By mid-1945, Japan's air defenses existed more on paper than in reality. Fighter squadrons listed on organization charts had no aircraft or no fuel. Pilots were available but had minimal training. Some Japanese pilots in 1945 received fewer than 100 hours of flight instruction before being sent to operational units. American pilots typically received over 300 hours of training, often much more. The quality differential compounded the numerical disadvantage. Japanese pilots, even when they could get airborne, faced American formations defended by gunners, who had been extensively trained and equipped with computing gun sights that compensated for target motion, range, and ballistic drop. The Japanese pilot attacking a B-29 formation faced defensive fire from dozens of half-inch caliber machine guns. Each B-29 carried 10 machine guns in remotely controlled turrets, plus a tail gunner's position with 2 guns and a 20mm cannon. A formation of 300 B-29s brought 3,000 half-inch caliber machine guns to bear against attackers. The few Japanese fighters that reached attack position faced overwhelming defensive firepower. Most Japanese pilots never completed their attacks. They were shot down on their approach runs or broke away after firing a few ineffective bursts from extreme range. The personal accounts of Japanese pilots who survived the war reveal the psychological impact of facing the bomber streams. One fighter pilot, interviewed decades later, described his first intercept attempt against a B-29 formation in early 1945. He had been told to expect about 50 bombers. When he climbed to altitude and saw the formation, he counted over 200 aircraft before giving up counting and simply staring at the sky filled with bombers. "I felt like an insect," he recalled. "They were so many, and I was so small. I fired my guns at one bomber and saw my bullets hit the wing. Nothing happened. The bomber continued flying. I turned to attack another, and tracer fire from somewhere hit my aircraft. I dove away and returned to base. I had achieved nothing." Another pilot described attacking a formation and seeing his cannon shells exploding against a B-29's fuselage without apparent effect. The bomber's armor and structure could absorb significant damage and continue flying. Japanese fighters, by contrast, were lightly built to save weight and maximize maneuverability. A single burst of half-inch caliber fire often destroyed a Japanese fighter completely. The psychological toll extended beyond the pilots to ground crews, civilians, and military leadership. Officers who had spent years planning for decisive battles where courage and tactical skill would prevail found themselves facing industrial warfare where numbers and logistics determined outcomes. The samurai tradition that emphasized individual warrior spirit seemed irrelevant when the enemy could simply overwhelm any defense through sheer quantity of aircraft and bombs. Private diaries and letters from this period, recovered and studied by historians after the war, reveal a pervasive sense of helplessness. "We train to fight, but there is nothing to fight with," one Army officer wrote in his diary in June 1945. "The Americans bomb our cities and we can only watch. Our fighters sit on the ground for lack of fuel. Our factories produce nothing because the workers are dead or fled. We are defeated but ordered to fight on." The civilian experience was even more desperate. Families in cities waited each day, wondering if tonight would be when the B-29s came. Air raid shelters provided minimal protection against incendiary bombs. The firestorms created by massed incendiary attacks killed people in shelters by consuming all available oxygen. Survivors described suffocating in shelters while the fires raged above, or emerging to find neighborhoods vanished and bodies everywhere. The government's response became increasingly disconnected from reality. Radio broadcasts exhorted civilians to maintain fighting spirit and trust in ultimate victory. These messages rang hollow when cities burned and food shortages worsened. The government organized civilian defense units armed with bamboo spears to resist the expected American invasion. Training middle-aged men and teenage boys to charge tanks with bamboo spears demonstrated how completely military realism had collapsed. By July 1945, Japan's situation was militarily hopeless. The firebombing campaign had destroyed most major cities. The naval blockade had strangled imports of food and raw materials. The Soviet Union had declared war and invaded Manchuria, destroying Japan's Kwantung army in days. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August added horror to an already desperate situation, but they were not the cause of surrender. Japan was already defeated by conventional bombing and blockade. The Emperor's surrender, broadcast on August 15, 1945, cited a new and most cruel bomb as justification for ending the war. This provided a face-saving explanation that allowed Japanese leadership to surrender without explicitly admitting they had been defeated by American industrial superiority. The atomic bombs were horrifying and unprecedented, but the truth, known to Japanese military leaders, was that conventional firebombing had already broken Japan's ability and will to continue fighting. In the months after the surrender, American strategic bombing surveys interviewed Japanese military and civilian officials to assess the bombing campaign's effectiveness. The responses were remarkably consistent. Japanese officials acknowledged that the bombing had made continuing the war impossible. Industrial production had collapsed. Transportation was paralyzed. Civilian morale was broken. Food shortages were producing starvation in cities. One Japanese general told American interrogators bluntly, "Your bomber production defeated us. We could not stop so many aircraft. We could not rebuild what you destroyed. We could not feed our people when our cities burned. The war ended because we had nothing left to fight with." Another official, when asked what single factor most contributed to Japan's defeat, answered without hesitation, "Your industrial capacity. You built more of everything than we could imagine. More ships, more planes, more tanks, more ammunition. We knew you were strong. We did not know you were so strong that our entire military could not slow you down." The statistics from the bombing campaign tell the story with brutal clarity. From June 1944 through August 1945, B-29s flew 33,141 sorties against Japan. They dropped 170,000 tons of bombs. They destroyed approximately 178 square miles of urban area across 66 cities. They killed between 330,000 and 500,000 civilians, depending on which estimates are accepted. American losses totaled 494 B-29s lost to all causes, including combat, mechanical failure, and operational accidents. This represented a loss rate of approximately 1.5% of sorties flown. For comparison, the 8th Air Force bombing Germany lost bombers at rates exceeding 5% of sorties during much of 1943 and 1944. The Japanese air defenses, hampered by limited resources and overwhelming numbers of attackers, inflicted far fewer losses than German defenses, despite fighting with equal courage and determination. The industrial arithmetic that won the air war over Japan was the same arithmetic that won the war in every theatre. American factories produced approximately 296,000 aircraft during the war, all types combined. Japan produced approximately 76,000. The United States built 86,000 tanks. Japan built approximately 4,000. The United States produced 2 million trucks. Japan produced approximately 165,000. These numbers, repeated across every category of military equipment, meant that American forces could afford losses and operational wastage that would cripple other nations. Equipment could be expended freely because replacements were always available. The famous American logistical tale, where support personnel outnumbered combat troops, was possible only because industrial production provided the equipment and supplies that support personnel managed. For Japanese commanders who had planned for a war of decisive battles where Bushido spirit would overcome material disadvantages, the reality of industrial warfare proved impossible to counter. Spirit couldn't manufacture aircraft engines. Courage couldn't produce aviation fuel. Willingness to die couldn't stop incendiary bombs from burning cities. The lesson was harsh and absolute. Modern warfare between industrial nations was decided by production capacity. The side that could build more weapons, train more soldiers, and sustain operations longer would win. Tactical brilliance and individual heroism mattered in individual battles. But industrial capacity determined who won the war. Colonel Takeo Yamada, who had watched in disbelief as 300 B-29s approached Tokyo in November 1944, survived the war. He was interviewed in the 1970s by historians researching the air campaign. He described his reactions on that day and the progression of his thinking as the raids continued month after month. "At first I thought we could stop them," he said. "Our fighters would learn their tactics. Our gunners would improve their accuracy. We would find their weaknesses, but they had no weakness except numbers, and those numbers kept increasing. By March, when the firebombing began, I knew we were defeated. Not defeated in battle, defeated before battle, by their factories." He paused, looking out the window at modern Tokyo, rebuilt completely from the ashes of 1945. "We thought we were fighting America's military," he continued. "We were really fighting America's factories." "And how do you fight factories? You cannot shoot them down. You cannot outmaneuver them. They simply build more than you can destroy. That is what defeated us. Not the atomic bombs, not the invasion that never came, simply their ability to make the sky filled with bombers and keep doing it until nothing remained of our cities." The lesson of the B-29 campaign over Japan transcended the specific historical moment. It demonstrated that industrial capacity, properly mobilized and efficiently organized, could achieve effects that no amount of courage or tactical skill could counter. The bomber offensive that broke Japan's will and capacity to continue fighting was possible only because American industry could produce thousands of complex aircraft and sustain their operations across 12,000 miles of ocean. This was the arsenal of democracy, functioning at peak capacity. Factories in Kansas and Washington, Nebraska and Georgia produced bombers by the hundreds. Oil refineries in California and Texas produced fuel by the millions of gallons. Chemical plants across the nation produced explosives by the thousands of tons. All of it was coordinated, shipped across the Pacific, and employed in an air campaign that systematically dismantled Japan's ability to wage war. The Japanese commanders who counted American B-29s and couldn't believe 1,000 bombers appeared in one raid were witnessing the material expression of industrial supremacy. The numbers seemed impossible because they were unprecedented. No nation in history had ever projected such power across such distances for such duration. The achievement reflected not just engineering excellence or tactical innovation, but something deeper: the productive capacity of an entire mobilized society committed to victory regardless of cost. When the bombers finally stopped coming in August 1945, they stopped not because American capacity was exhausted, but because there were no more targets worth bombing. Japan's cities were already destroyed. The factories were already burned. The transportation system was already paralyzed. The war was already won. The sky above Japan, which had seemed filled with an endless procession of bombers for so many months, was suddenly empty. The silence must have been strange after the constant roar of engines and explosions. Japanese citizens emerged from shelters and rural hiding places to begin the enormous task of rebuilding. They rebuilt their cities. They rebuilt their industry. They rebuilt their lives. But those who witnessed the bombing campaign never forgot what they had seen: an entire nation's industrial capacity converted into flying machines that darkened the sky and rained destruction until nothing remained to destroy. They had learned the lesson that Colonel Yamada articulated: in industrial warfare, production decides outcomes. The side with more factories, more resources, and better organization will prevail regardless of tactical situations or individual courage. The B-29s that filled Japanese skies in 1945 represented more than just aircraft. They represented the culmination of American industrial mobilization. Each bomber was the product of thousands of workers, hundreds of companies, and an entire economy dedicated to producing the tools of war faster and in greater quantity than any enemy could match. Japanese commanders had counted the bombers and found the numbers impossible to believe. 1,000 bombers in one raid, 300 bombers the next day, 500 bombers the day after. The stream never stopped because the factories never stopped. That was the arithmetic that won the war. Not the arithmetic of battles won or casualties inflicted, but the simpler arithmetic of production. Build more than the enemy can destroy. Replace losses faster than they occur. Continue operations until the enemy's capacity collapses. By that measure, the American industrial victory over Japan was absolute and irreversible. The skies belonged to America because American factories could fill those skies with bombers. And that simple fact, more than any battle or strategy, determined how the war would end. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.